Too many people are a captive to what the ADP is.
What is your plan, and are you there at the end of the draft? Because if you find yourself in that position where the draft ends and you are not happy with your team, it's tough.
That's that tier down lateral trade that I always talk about, but in a startup draft. What I couldn't be more anti is about getting your guy over proven talent that is more likely to hold value than your guy is to gain value. Just because you drafted this team doesn't mean this has to be your team forever. Today, we're back with more startup draft mistakes. There are so many startup draft mistakes made in Dynasty that we had to split it up into 2 videos. So be sure to go check that one out after you watch this one. There's no real chronological order to it. It's all just kind of there. So stay tuned to make sure you're avoiding these very common mistakes in your next startup draft. And as always, I do hope you all enjoy the video. Please leave a like if you do. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself. And please be sure to let us know any draft mistakes you've made so we can help others. But hey, with all that said, let's get right to the content you came for. Moving on to the next point here, we've touched on this a little bit. Big mistake we see, Zach, trading miles down the board. You know, not trading 4, 5, 6 picks down the board. We're trading a round, 2 rounds, 3 rounds, 4 rounds down the board in one single trade. We discussed this quite a bit in other startup mock draft videos and other discussions. When we're drafting, we're huge fans of trading down. We will always advocate first move, trade down. Always. Maybe not with your super high picks like your 1-0 whatever, 102, 3, 101 whatever. Maybe you can if you get really good value, but you definitely want to get that elite talent if you can. But however, if we move down too much, we miss out on a ton of value. I'd love to hear your thoughts here, Zach.
Yeah, it's a very interesting conversation when we get to this point, right? And again, I'm somebody that if you're trading with me, we're having a dialogue. There's almost no ifs, ands, or buts about it because typically we don't. The first offer, whether I'm offering it or someone else is offering it, it's not close. But I see that, hey, there's an avenue here to make a trade. So there's a dialogue. The way I always put this is if somebody wants to move up to my whatever my first round pick is, whether it's 103, 109, whatever it is. If they're offering you something like a 4th round pick and then a 1st round pick next year, this is what I say to them. So you're getting a top 10 startup asset, and you're offering me the 40th best player plus a 1st round pick next year, which I have no idea where that lands. That puts it into context of what you're off. I like the other person to see how bad the trade offer is, so we can work on getting somewhere better. And I know typically I'm not the guy like, yo, here's my not best offer. I will always try to send my best offer. I will try. I really am like not trying to, oh, here's a bad offer in hopes that you ask for a little bit. I don't do that. I kind of get straight to the point. But if somebody's trying to maneuver up the draft board to give themselves 2 top 10 players, that likely means, Bob, that they are a playoff team. They're adding a Jamar Chase and a Justin Jefferson. They're adding a Jonathan Taylor and a Josh Allen. Whatever scenario it may be, that says that 1st round pick next year is not going to be very high. What am I getting in a trade that is okay for me to get a late 1st round pick back? I need more than the 40th best player. I need the 15th best player and a 1st round pick next year. What, you know, I don't know exactly where the values lie, but that's the conversation I'm having. And typically when you say, hey, listen, you're going to be a playoff team if you get 2 top 10 guys. I'm probably not. So you have to compensate me for taking the hit. And you have to compensate me more than the 40th best player overall and a random rookie next year who is more than likely a late 1st round pick. You have to compensate me. And typically people will see that. They will understand that point of view. And as opposed to just like sending another offer. It's, hey, let me show you and tell you why I am asking for more. And that typically gets it done. Like I am, and just like you, Bob, we're big believers in if you want to trade back in a startup draft, by all means. But we're not trading back from the 1st to the 5th round.
Nope.
Like, no. We're going back to the 2nd round, and we'll get 2 players in the 2nd round and a pick next year. Or I'll go back to the 2nd round and you give me a 5th round pick in the startup draft. Give me something of value to make it worth my time.
The way I always look at it is, you know, looking at some fixes here, this is what we kind of refer to as the inchworm strategy. You just work your way down the board.
That was me, by the way. I trademarked that.
I'm pretty sure I said that first, and you.
I don't think so, man.
Whatever.
There was a video where I was like this.
Yeah, I understand. I recall, but I'm pretty sure I recalled it or called that.
We got to put that. We got to put a poll up on that.
Yeah, no, we're not going to do that. But looking at the interim strategy, you can acquire so much more value moving down 5-6 picks at a time. If you move down from the first round to the 5th round, you missed out on 4 opportunities, probably at least, to move down 5, 6, 7 picks and pick up another draft pick for a future year. And then you only get the 1, maybe 2 assets in return. That's kind of where you make the mistake. The way I like to look at it, moving down 5, 6 picks at a time, instead of making that one big move down the board and grabbing 1 additional pick, you move twice, get 2 additional picks. Also, moving down in smaller increments is more likely to keep you within the same tier of players. So if you do end up drafting someone, but you pick up an additional asset, you're still getting a similar caliber player, which is huge. That's where that's that tier down lateral trade that I always talk about, but in a startup draft is essentially what you're doing there. You're just adding value on top of something that's already similar value, just for letting somebody go get their guy. Here's the go get your guy tax on that. And then, when you can execute this right, and it is, not always easy, because I think, I thought that before we did that draft with our patrons last year, that people were on the bandwagon of, well, let's always trade down. And I thought, well, I might have to pivot my strategy and be the guy that trades up now. Because when zagging like that, you have to make that move. But we were both still able to move down the board several times. And my biggest goal when I'm moving down, especially if I move out of the first round, is I want to get multiple picks in as many of the top 6, 7 rounds as I can. I want to have 2/3, 2/4, 2/5, 2/6, 2/7 if I can. And what that does is it makes your team a heck of a lot more top heavy with startable depth, which in the first year, and most of my leagues, I play like 9, 10, 11 starters. I love playing in leagues like that. So when I have 14 starting caliber players to go up against your 6 or 7 reasonably high end, I'm going to win. Even if maybe I don't have the super high end talent at a couple positions, I'm going to win that matchup because I have more pieces that can put up 10 to 15, 20 points, as opposed to you have a couple that can put up 25, but the rest are scratching for 15 or 20. And then there's some that are getting 10 points. And
that's where your league scoring comes in, but the starting format comes in.
Yep.
Is it start 8 guys and a kicker and a defense, or is it start 11 guys? Because if I'm trading up to get a Jamar Chase, I'm leaving my team vulnerable somewhere else. That means I'm starting, I love this guy, but it means I'm starting Mac Hollins somewhere too. One other point I just wanted to address real quick is, although Bob and I are talking about a specific draft where we traded down, we both made moves in that draft where we traded up. Yep. Because we identified a player that we thought we were going to miss out on. Whether or not our strategy is something you agree with, there were probably points where players we wanted went off the board before we expected, and so we had to make a move to get a guy before that guy in the same tier, like you just talked about, was off the board. So absolutely trade back, but don't be afraid to trade up either. Like if there's somebody you want to get, it's for me, it's always like, I would prefer to trade back mostly, but I don't want to miss out on certain players. And if I have to move up, I will use some of my capital and assets to do that as well.
Can confirm we both made a few moves here and there to move up. Nothing crazy, handful of picks, 3, 4, 5 picks tops to go get our guy. And that was, something we'll kind of touch on a little bit later. Before we get to that, another piece here, another mistake. This is a mistake that redrafters talk about all the time, and that is not adjusting the draft as it happens. And, it's awesome to have a draft strategy going in, year 1 punt, all in year 1, wide receiver heavy, RB0, whatever the case is. But just like redraft, like I said, you need to adjust to the board as it falls. Sticking to a game plan that no longer has a real possibility of panning out is a great way to start off with a poor team build that is likely maybe not even conducive to the league scoring anymore. It might just end up being a hodgepodge mess that turns into a rebuild real quick. Like one of those teams that you mentioned that after the draft, it's like, man, this did not go how I wanted it to, and now this team is in a bad spot. And it's best to do this early when you're still flexible with the pieces you have. So like if you realize, you were trying to go, let's say, all in year 1, and a lot of the aging assets that are scoring a lot of points have come off the board early because somebody is drafting with a redraft mindset in mind, that's where maybe you pivot to, maybe I'm looking a year out instead. And maybe you look to draft a little younger and you avoid older players, things like that. How do we kind of fix this? How do we work with it? What are the issues here?
Just the most important thing is just not finding yourself in that position that you just talked about, where you're sitting after the draft and you're looking at your team and you're like, damn, like this is not where I want it to be. I'm a big believer in this is my plan before the draft. I absolutely will adjust if I need to. But at the end of the draft, I know where I am. I know where I am in terms of like year one. I'm competing. There's a situation, and this happened in our Patreon league, where I like my team. And if somebody wants to sell pieces, I'm interested because I have the capital to do so. Sure. Like, what is your plan? And are you there at the end of the draft? Because if you find yourself in that position where the draft ends and you are not happy with your team, it's tough. It's tough depending on the context of what happened. You could have made a lot of win now moves and your league has 12 starting spots and you really only have 7 or 8 starting caliber players. And now you're hoping to pick up Curtis Samuel off the waiver wire week 1 or whatever it may be. This is a situation where the startup drafts, for the most part, in my opinion, need to be slow drafts.
100%. I was going to say the same thing.
Because the stakes in Dynasty are forever. They are as long as your league exists.
Yeah. Longer reaching by far.
Right, exactly. So decisions should not be made on a whim. They should be made with thought and time to adjust to whatever's happening on the draft board, to respond to people who are messaging you. And so for me, like, you have to see, like Bob said, what's happening before you. Do you see teams that are targeting young players only? And there is a young player that you're interested in. And you know that if you pass this player up, this other guy who's drafting rookies is going to get him. That a lot of people, that happened with Dameon Pierce. The later the startup draft, July, August, September, the earlier Dameon Pierce was going in startup drafts. Yep. So you needed to adjust to that information. Is this guy only drafting rookies? Well, I need to get these rookies that I like now in a startup draft. Hopefully your league is not doing a startup draft without rookies and then a rookie only. Like, that's just a weird thing to do.
Looking at fixes here for me, be mindful of the pieces you have and what other builds can you make work with the rest of the pieces left on the board. And I kind of touched on this already. If you're able, and this is why I don't like drafting a player that pigeonholes me in rounds 1 and 2. I don't necessarily want to draft a win now running back in rounds 1 and 2. Like, I don't want to start my draft with Jonathan Taylor. Like, as much as I love Jonathan Taylor, went to Wisconsin, my college, didn't go there, but that's my college team. So, as much as I love the player, I don't want to build a team around him because it pigeonholes me right away in the draft. Whereas if, I get a good wide receiver early, maybe Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, I immediately have flexibility, or I have a quarterback, immediate flexibility. Tight end gives me a little less flexibility, but it solids me at one position. I'm probably done working there for a while. Just puts me at a need for a quarterback, whatever, something for another day. With the pieces you have, and building off flexibility, what can you pivot to? How can you build out this roster in your draft that, might not be the direction you wanted to go, but can still work? What pieces do you have that you could build for a year out? You can go productive, struggle, work with everything except running back, and the caveat with Jonathan Taylor is, who, depending on what platform you look at, isn't even the running back 1 anymore. But the thing with that is you do have a piece that you can trade for a lot of capital or pieces. That's the one caveat that gives you some flexibility, but having to rely on a trade, don't love doing that without having the trade in my inbox. If everyone else wants to trade down, maybe you turn into the team that trades up, like I kind of referenced to earlier, and the team that competes year 1. But if everybody's still willing to trade up, you can still be that team that trades down. If the position you were targeting dries up, instead of reaching on the 25th best running back in the draft, grab the 13th best wide receiver or a top 6 tight end. Basically, my fixes there. Zach, any other thoughts here to kind of how we can avoid getting into a bad situation after not adjusting to the draft, or, how do we adjust to the draft as it happens?
Look, I think you covered it mostly. And to me, it's just a situation of this all goes into like knowing what you're getting yourself into beforehand. You don't want to be figuring this out on the fly, right? You don't want the draft to start and be like, what are the league scoring? Like, you don't want to find yourself in that situation. And again, we've all been there. We've all made those mistakes. And we're trying to prevent the next generation of Dynasty players from having that issue because we've been there. We've done that. And it's a crappy place to be. Go into your startup draft with a plan, be flexible, but you got to have an end game, right? You got to have again, I'll keep saying this over and over again. You just don't want to be in a position where you're looking at the team after the draft and be like, this is a whole lot more work now than I thought it was going to be. Like my idea after the startup draft is, okay, I know what's going to happen this year. I'm not going to be good this year, and that's okay. Come the trade deadline, I'll try and sell some of these pieces to some of the contending teams. We got to let that work itself out. But I like you just gotta know how year one is gonna go for you. Yeah, you can change plans. Like and I think in our patron league, I traded for Josh Allen. I didn't have that in mind, but there was a team that didn't like how their startup draft went, and I engaged that owner in a conversation, and voila, I'm now a team with Josh Allen at the helm. My plan was to not have a long-term rebuild at the end of that startup draft, which may surprise some people who are watching this video because a lot of my startup drafts, I suck year one. Like it's just the way I do business. You've got to be flexible in terms of how you're going to maneuver the draft board, how you're going to maneuver the roster, the scoring settings. But you got to know the long-term vision. Like to me, that is the most important thing is know do you want to compete year one? Do you want to compete year two and year one? Hey, let's see how this goes. Is there a move I can make? Is there a free agent I could pick up that nobody's expecting? I keep using Curtis Samuel as an example because nobody had Curtis Samuel rostered in any league prior to week one, for the most part. Maybe in our Patreon league because we have 40 roster spots. But
heck yeah, we do.
You have to adjust to these bits and pieces of information coming at you in your startup draft as well.
The last thing to touch on with that, and I think you make an awesome point of having that long-term vision. And I think the thing with that is being able to always, maybe your vision was to compete year one as the draft starts and as it's going, but then it doesn't go as planned. And now maybe you have to think of a way to pivot, change the mindset of how do I get to that now? How do I get to what was going to be a year one compete is now a year one punt? How do I get there? What pieces can I move? Who made very competitive moves year one? Who drafted a redraft team? Who can I send Cooper Kupp to now that, the rest of my draft kind of went kaput? That flexibility is being able to pivot from one strategy to another and, kind of having the know-how and the reasoning of what makes a long-term rebuild, what makes a year one rebuild and things like that. And that stuff, we probably have to get into on the channel a little more and we'll have to do that. But that is a teaser for now.
Well, just one real quick anecdote to add on to that. You said what teams are making aggressive moves. Take that a little bit further. Look at people's usernames. Whose username is Broncos for life? And I have Jerry Jeudy, right? Like I don't want Jerry Jeudy, whatever. You brought up a great example, and I'm just taking it a step further. Like know the people in your league. Who's drafting all the Jets players? Find those little things that you can take advantage. Because again, it's a little bit of luck, a lot of planning, but there's a psychological aspect to fantasy and dynasty football that will make you that much better if you take advantage of it.
This one is one of my pet peeves, and I think something that every dynasty manager has struggled with at some point, whether it be in a startup draft, rookie draft, when it comes to like trades, things like that, just picking up players off the waiver wire, passing up on value to get your guy. And now I'm all about believing in players, 100%, about having my guys, your guys, our guys, things like that. What I couldn't be more anti is about getting your guy over proven talent that is more likely to hold value than your guy is to gain value. A prime example of this, I believe, is Amari Cooper. Per DLF ADP, Amari Cooper was being drafted in startup drafts at wide receiver 34 back in August. Guys being drafted around him: Darnell Mooney, Sky Moore, Kadarius Toney. Now Amari Cooper is a top 10 wide receiver on the season, and whether you're a competing team or one that is already looking to next year, Amari Cooper will net you far more value than any of those other options in trades right now. And, imagine maybe you didn't like Amari Cooper. You can more than likely get a later first round pick next year for Amari Cooper. And now guess what? Now you have a fresh running back off the presses, a decent wide receiver. There might even be a quarterback kicking around back there, or Michael Mayer, the top 10 tight end coming out next year. For Amari Cooper, a guy you didn't necessarily want to draft, but you soaked up the value. You took the value it was given to you.
That's a very tough one. Because everybody's different in how and who they value in certain spots in the draft. So sometimes there's, and this is probably something I've been very guilty of, And I just like for some reason, I just don't like the player. It's a very intricate conversation there. And it's probably one that I struggle with. Like when I came up on this on the show sheet, I'm like, I'm pretty bad at this one. Like, you know, because I am targeting I'm targeting certain players.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter to me the talent sometimes of a player. For me, my strategy there is I'm targeting guys. I targeted Chris Olave in that draft. And I'll be honest with you, you were the first person that really started the changing of my mind of Chris Olave. So that's a very difficult topic to get into because I have a certain way I go about that. And I believe in that certain way. I identify the talent that I want regardless of the value. Now I try to maximize that value just like I did with Olave. I could have drafted Olave at 106.
Sure.
But I really felt that he'd be there at 108. That's a very interesting topic of conversation. Just depends on how you go about the draft. Again, for me, I'm targeting players regardless of value. If I have to move up, I will. If I have to move back, I probably will try to do that and risk losing out on the player to gain or to take advantage of more capital in a trade.
And I will say this is an idea that's somewhat cherry picked but the thing is, Amari Cooper's been relatively viable throughout his career wherever he's been. Now he's been with better quarterbacks than Jacoby Brissett, and I don't think anybody necessarily saw this coming. But you had to think that he was going to be better than wide receiver 34. Especially better than guys like Darnell Mooney, in my opinion. Sky Moore, Kadarius Toney wasn't even on my startup draft boards for the most part, if at all, and definitely not anywhere near Amari Cooper. And like you said, I've been guilty of this too. That's why it's on this list, because I audited myself and been like, hey, this is something I've caught myself doing in drafts where I want to get the sexy name that's 8 picks down the board instead of these guys that are going to actually put up fantasy points. Michael Gallup was another guy going around him too, a guy who people knew wasn't going to be playing for a good bit of the season or possibly wasn't going to start the season healthy. And, Michael Gallup still hasn't been great, but it's just kind of that concept of, not necessarily depending on the draft and where people are. Like you said, there's a lot of nuance to this because it's not throughout the entire draft board that this is an issue. It's kind of an isolated incident that players, especially later on in drafts, when you get outside the, top, let's say 50 to 60 players is usually where you'll see this kind of odd range where we have a lot of very high upside names like Darnell Mooney, Sky Moore, Kadarius Toney. And then you have guys that are more realistically actually going to score fantasy points that just aren't as sexy of a name, like Amari Cooper. Looking back to the points about age and youth, take the value as it's given. You need points on your roster at the end of the day. If you don't end up needing the points this year, trade them away for points next year, whether that be draft capital, younger players that aren't performing yet. Trade Amari Cooper for a Drake London, or trade Amari Cooper in like a second-round pick for a Drake London, something like that. If a team was competing, they needed a first-round pick or somebody to actually put up fantasy points, Amari Cooper could actually do that for him, and getting him a second-round pick back doesn't hurt the matter either. But if you really, really want that player, and this goes to something you said as well, trade down and accrue some value before you draft that player. That'd be the biggest key. If you really want to take that shot, do something to draft that player at a more appropriate ADP and appropriate value.
Yeah, it's very rare in a startup or a rookie draft. And I don't mean, I'm not talking about the 15th round of a startup, and I'm not talking about the 4th round of the rookie draft, but it's very rare in the meat and potatoes of any draft where I'm just taking best player available. That maybe happens first round of a startup draft. That's it. For the most part, I have a plan and I'm targeting certain players. And that's not one player. I'm targeting in a startup draft. I'm targeting 3, 4 players. In a rookie draft, typically I am targeting one player, 1 or 2 players. And I will maneuver my board around that, whether I got to move up or whether I got to move or I'm able to move back and acquire. Now, if you move back, you are at the whim of whatever happens. Like if you lose on your guy, that sucks. And that has happened to me a lot in the startup draft. It's a part of taking the risk. I'm usually going in with a plan, rookie drafts as well. Who am I targeting? What position do I need on my team, and what player do I like best at that position? And I'm making my rookie draft and startup draft around that plan as well, and how I can maneuver around the player or players I'm interested in.
Moving on to the last point, maybe, that I have for y'all today, or have for us today, using ADP too religiously or not enough. This last point is very tricky. ADP itself is very tricky. Too many people are a captive to what the ADP is. I can't draft that person yet because the ADP says he's like a round later. And this kind of goes against what I just said, oddly enough. But this too should be used as a loose guideline, and if done so, can become a great asset to you because too many people use it like a Bible. Going back to a lot of religious references today, but that's okay. On the flip side of that coin, there are those who totally neglect ADP, which is what leads to mistakes like the previous ones that we discussed. They'll just scroll down the draft board for the next player they like, they feel is the most sexy, has the most upside. And instead of that, or instead of taking the value that's given, they'll draft the player they just want more without any real assurance that that player is ever going to be anything. What do you do with ADP? Mm-hmm. How do you maneuver around it? Do you use it religiously? Do you use it as a guideline? Do you just say, ADP sucks and I'm not going to use it?
Yeah, the more I worked my way down this list that you made, Bob, the more I felt targeted.
I'm sorry.
Because
it wasn't intentional.
I would say I learned some lessons last year in startup drafts by sticking too much to ADP. And I want to bring this home with, I just feel like condensing this to the rookie draft will help a little bit. But two situations both ways, right? There was a league that I was in. An owner had 104, and this was around August, September. So a lot of opinions are starting to be formulated about the rookies. People are getting an idea of what's happening in training camp. And the guy at 104 really did try to trade back, and he couldn't. Nobody wanted to. It's a league that's not very active, and so he took Dameon Pierce at 104. And I was like, "Oh my God! Like, what are you doing?" And lo and behold, this guy was right, man. This guy was right. So, and again, he tried to trade back. He didn't stick with the ADP there, and he was right. Okay. Sure. Now, here's another situation where you should, if you can, whether or not you like the player is meaningless to me. You may have a different feeling, but if you can move back, if he could have moved back to 107, Dameon Pierce would have still been there. Okay, because everybody in the league was like, whoa, what just happened? If you can move back for a player that's not going to be picked soon, like, do it. Here's another situation. This was the rookie draft in May of last year, where a team selected Romeo Doubs at the 202. It's like, and he didn't even try to trade back. Like, you should be able to know that Romeo Doubs' ADP is not anywhere near 202. And again, this is not September, and even still that'd be high. This is May, right after the draft. Romeo Doubs, 202. That's two situations there presenting both sides of the argument, where at the very least, whether or not you like a player, if their ADP is so significantly different from where they're being drafted, I'm a firm believer of you can move back a little bit, if at all possible, and still get that player there. Now, again, you risk losing them. That's a risk. And that's going to happen sometimes. Know like where the player's ADP is generally, but use that information to your advantage and make sure that you're not overdrafting a player. So it's just a situation of being like hyper aware of the player's ADP, and can you maneuver around that? Again, it's not a, and I gave you two situations there that I think really represent both spectrums of it. Like, hey, both one owner tried to trade back and didn't, went out and got his guy, and it worked. The other owner absolutely did not try to trade, whatever. And right now he's sitting at the 102 in our league. Know your board, know how to try to maneuver around it. And if you got to go get your guy, go get your guy.
Looking at fixes here for me, one of the real keys to winning your startup for me is having your own rankings or rankings you trust. And then by just being mindful of the ADP on whatever platform you're using, just kind of have it, have a screen or another notebook, whatever you have to be able to be mindful of what the ADP actually is. But this becomes a great way to notice values and reaches and helps you maneuver around the draft board that caters to you and helps more when you're trying to make trades. In quotes here, this player is higher in my rankings than his ADP suggests, so I can probably trade down a bit here and add some value and still get my guy. That's one way to look at it. And that to me is the better process than just reaching on your guy to go get your guy. Like, I like the concept going to get your guy, getting like Chris Olave, somebody I wanted to get in as many drafts as I possibly could. And he was somebody that I was willing to, put a stamp on and go get at maybe a little bit higher ADP than he was suggested at. At the end of the day, for most cases or a lot of cases, when the ADP is wildly off, instead of reaching 8 picks down the board. Like for that example, the guy that didn't even try to trade down to get Dobbs, who probably could have been had at the top of the third at worst, or with his next pick, if he had a 3rd round pick, should have traded down, should have gotten something else there, obviously. And that kind of shows how, like you said, one guy, it's kind of paid off. There's probably more people that most people want more than Dameon Pierce in a rookie draft right now, if you were to redraft the class. But at the end of the day, it's not bad. It's not looking as bad as people thought it was. That's for sure. So that's just how I would go about it, how I'd go about playing with ADP and startup drafts. I think that's kind of the way to work around it, not necessarily play with it, use it as a guideline, maybe to, because the thing about average draft capital, ADP, is pulled from people drafting. Where are people drafting these players? So it's not something that you should, expect Chris Olave is going to go at wide receiver 12 in each draft, because if he's going in my drafts, he's probably going at wide receiver 7. But it is something that in most drafts you could kind of think, if I really want this guy, I should draft him at maybe a couple spots ahead of what his ADP suggests, is kind of the thought process. And, if that's not where your pick is, find a way to get your pick there. That'd be the next move, essentially. In the simplest format, if you want a guy and you think he's going to go here, find a way to get your pick there. That'd be the move.
If you're doing a startup draft, don't do a long draft, but participate in a mock draft. Participate in a quick mock, see where players are going, see where values. And rookie drafts, dude, we got you covered here, man. Yeah, rookie drafts for 2023 have already started on this channel. So watch those. Know the player evaluations, because if you don't, I literally had a conversation with the guy that drafted Dobbs, and I'm like, "What happened?" He's like, "Oh, I didn't know." And I was like, "Dude, I set up the Dynasty Rewind mock draft. I'm like, you drafted a guy at 202 who went the 4th round. Like, what are you doing?" So this all goes into have a plan, do your research, adjust to the information,
and prepare in general. Just be prepared. Moving on to the last bonus tip I have that I did not put on the show sheet that I thought about as we were coming into the room. Bonus tip: just because you drafted this team doesn't mean this has to be your team forever. And this is a prime example of this is the team that I currently have in the league we share together. That team in the starting lineup has, I think, 3 players out of 11 that I drafted. And now that's because Marquise Brown is on my bench because he's on a bye week. But there are not a lot of players on that team in my starting lineup that I drafted. So what did I do with that? I drafted the team I drafted. And it's not that I didn't necessarily like that team, but I was just like, if I want to win this league this year, like I think I can, I need to make some moves, and I need to make them quickly. Mm-hmm. And with all the draft capital I accrued going through the draft process, the startup draft process, all the valued assets I had, I was able to make a lot of moves to make my team a strong competitor. And while I'm on the fringe of making the playoffs because I've had a difficult schedule, I have a very competitive team, and I still have the 101 draft pick locked up for next year after making a significant amount of trades and adding some pretty good capital to my team. But that team that you draft, this is Dynasty. It's not like redraft. You're not stuck with that team for any amount of time. You could trade that whole team away the day after the draft. You've alluded to it a little bit already. If that team doesn't fit what you wanted right out of the gate, find a new plan. What plan can work for that team with what you have? And you know what? With team audits, we can always help you out too if you don't like your team, how it ended up. Or maybe you do and you just need some guidance. Information for audits will be down in the description. Some shameless plug action there. Well, that is it for the video today. I do hope you all enjoyed. Please be like if you did. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself. Be sure to let us know if you've made any of these mistakes and any others you might have made as well. And of course, did you watch part 1 yet? If you haven't, be sure to check that out right here. And if you have watched that, but you haven't checked out our startup draft strategy video, that'll be right here for you as well. But hey, that's going to be it for us today. We will see y'all in the next one. But until then, y'all have a good one.